Oh my gosh, hang on a second. Sherry, Dr. Penny, how are you?
Good, John. Good
Well,
morning.
listen, I got Michelle on the other line because when it comes to technical stuff, I'm Gomer Pyle and Forrest Gump. I mean, six-year-olds handle this stuff better than I do. So now I'm so excited to talk to you. Now, do I hang up on Michelle?
You do, because you're talking to me through the camera here.
Okay, Michelle, thanks, dear. Bye. Oh my gosh, you have no idea how pleased I am to be talking to you. No, aside from being a huge fan,
Aw.
I have the 5,000 number limit of. Can you see me
Yep,
okay?
you're perfect, and I can hear you just
Uh,
fine. You're great.
oh, okay. I love your hair, by the way. In any event, I have I have 5,000 the max of Facebook fans, and they're all over the world. And when I put up on Facebook that I was going to be talking to you, and Doctor, do you mind if I call you Sherry?
Most people call me Sherry or Dr. Sherry. That's just fine.
Oh, okay. Well, Doctor Sherry, I'll call you Doctor Sherry. And I've had just scores and scores of notes from Russia, from China, and from Australia talking about people, from people who are fans of yours who can't wait to hear the two of us chat. So
Well,
thank you so much for having me on
well, you're welcome.
after all this time.
Well, you're so welcome, John. And this is for those of you that are, we still got hundreds of people rolling in here this morning. This is John Barbour. And I'll tell you, we've got people on here from Lebanon and from Brazil and from the UK and Scotland. So, yeah, we've got a pretty good broad brush of people very interested in hearing what you have to say. You know, I've got so many questions that we could take a couple of hours with this. I mean, I read your bio, I read some stuff, some pieces from your book, and it's almost like I don't know where to begin. So I'm just going to dive in right here. You've obviously spent a lot of time in Hollywood. I mean, that was kind of a bit, one of the two big things that you did. How did you get started in that industry? And take us through what it was like to start your show, Real People, and it became number one. I think I'm really interested in that. We're going to start with there, and then we're going to go into JFK.
Oh, okay. Could I tell you a very quick story about how I ended up in Hollywood and why I ended up in Hollywood, and then we can get to Real People, because you know we're in lockdown now around the world, and people ask me how do I feel about being in lockdown. Well, Sherry, Dr. Sherry, I feel like I've been in lockdown all my life. I was born in the charity ward of the Salvation Army Hospital in Toronto. And my mother and father came from a severely dysfunctional family long before it was popular. And my father and mother fought so severely in 1939. My father joined the Canadian Army because he thought it'd be easier to fight the Germans than fight my mother. And then when he left, my mother brought uncles into my house like they were grapes. They came in bunches. They came to bed her and to booze her, but mostly to beat her. So from the time I was 6 years of age, I was out on the streets.
Wow.
And of course, when you're desperate to get attention, and when you're desperate to get attention and you come from a broken family, you don't do creative things, as you well know, Doctor. You do destructive things. So I spent most of my time at a reformatory or in jail. And fortunately, when I left the jail, I found the library, which was across the street. So being Canadian, I spent most of my time in a hockey rink, in a library, or in a movie theater. And at the end of the movies, it said made in Hollywood. So I fell in love with Frank Capra movies, and I fell in love with Hollywood. So I had been, from the ages of 15 to 17, a very addicted gambler and a thief. And everything that I could steal or earn, I would lose in all my gambling sessions. I'm between 15 and 17. And at one point, Dr. Sherry, I said to myself, you know, I'm not in this to make money. I am in this to make friends. But who wants to be friends with people like this? So I got two books, Scarny on cards and Scarny on dice, and Dr. Sherri. I memorized them. And I decided I was going to be a professional gambler.
Oh, wow.
And in 3 months, I won $700. And if you see the front of my book, the title of the book is Your Mother's Not a Virgin, and the subtitle is The Bumpy Life and Times of the Canadian Dropout Who Changed the Face of American Television. So I snuck in to the United States. I walked across the border with just a suit on, the suit that I had on the cover of that book. And I said I was going to be there 2 days, and I took the train to Las Vegas, which is Mecca for gamblers, even in the 1950s. And I'm going to tell you this. I am a non-believer, but all of the wonderful, magical things that happened to me in my life, from accidentally getting Real People on the air, becoming Jim Garrison's Boswell to do the two definitive documentaries on the murder of John Kennedy and the birth and purpose of fake news, to become Frank Sinatra's private writer for 4.5 years, to meet my wife and give birth to one of the three geniuses, which is my son. The three geniuses I've met have been Jim Garrison, Buckminster Fuller, and my son. So anyway, I'm on this train. And the train stops in northern Nevada. And I think, oh my God, the cops have called the train and said, you got to stop the train and get Johnny Barbour off. He's wanted by the Mounties back here. So I hopped off the train, and the nearest place I get was Lake Tahoe. And Lake Tahoe, if you've ever been to Canada and saw Banff National Park and Lake Louise, Lake Tahoe is beautiful. So for me as a 17-year-old, I walk into the Calneva Lodge, and it's like walking into a MGM Technicolor movie with Judy Garland and Mickey Rooney, and I am just overwhelmed. So I go to the crap table and I start to bet, and people are looking at me. And I think, oh my God, they know I'm 17 years of age. I bought a Stetson, Dr. Sherri, so that I would look older than 17. But they weren't looking at me. They were looking past me. So I turned around, and walking through the glass doors was Frank Sinatra, arm in arm with Sam Giancana, who was the mafia chieftain of Chicago. And the reason this 17-year-old knew him, because he was on the front page of the paper that left on the streets for the immigration and the cops to find. And everybody got absolutely still. And he and Giancana and their Praetorian guard of Italian bodyguards walked by. Hushed, here was the God. 1 week earlier at the Manor Theater in Toronto, I had seen Sinatra. The movie was called As Clouds Roll By, the Jerome Kern story, and there he is on this white pedestal singing Old Man River. Oh my God. Now he walks up, gets off the pedestal, walks past me. About less than 20 years later, I accidentally became his private writer. We'll get to that story because I'm trying to get to the story that you originally asked me, but I think it's important. I decided I went to Las Vegas, and I was doing well as a gambler. My game was single deck blackjack. But you know what, Angel? I felt like a robot. I wasn't alive. I wasn't emotional. I felt like I was having an out-of-body experience as this mathematician and scientist just making money. And I wanted my life to have meaning. So I just cashed in my chips and said, you know, I loved show business. I loved Hollywood. I'm going to Los Angeles. I go to Los Angeles and I get into a boarding room. You remember the 50s. It was the time of the blacklists. Remember the blacklists? And people walking around, you're maybe too young, obviously, but people walked around with little signs in their lapel that said, better dead than red. Well, in this boarding house, and it was all males, 7 males there. One of them, a jeweler, became a Jewish a Jewish jeweler whose wife had committed suicide, and he sold his house to start his life over, and he wanted to be alone. He got into this boarding house, and he became sort of my mentor, kind of adopted me. Anyway, there was a 28-year-old accountant, and he had this lapel on it, and he hated FDR. Now, again, you're too young to remember FDR, but this kid who was 28 never met FDR, of course, but he hated him. Why would he hate him? And he said that God so hated FDR because he was a commie that he made him a cripple. And then to further punish him for being a commie, he gave him an ugly little wife named Eleanor to wake up to. So we used to get in these arguments. Now, I knew nothing about politics, but I said to him, I said, why would you want to be dead? I said, you know, if you're alive, you can change colors, you can change your mind, you can change the world. And I said, you know, I know nothing about politics, but you told me that your father was collecting Social Security. You know that Social Security was instituted by Franklin Delano Roosevelt to save capitalism during the 30s. Social Security, that's a socialist program, a democratic program. And I said, you know, when I go around Los Angeles, I see hospitals and roads and schools and parks named after Roosevelt. But I said, the person who caused the Depression, according to Lenny, was a Republican named Hoover. And the only thing they named after Hoover was a vacuum cleaner. Well, everybody at the table applauded. He left the table. 5 minutes later, FBI agents surrounded the house. They had come in 3 cars to arrest this 17-year-old Canadian commie who was trying to overthrow the American government. And I tried to jump out the window, but they caught me. And they took me down and they fingerprinted me, and they saw, Dr. Sherri, I was no threat to the American government. I was only a threat to shop owners in Toronto. So they turned me over to the Immigration Service. And I'm at a place called Terminal Island in San Diego, and it was like being at Mar-a-Lago. I mean, it was just gorgeous. It was right on the beach. It was not guarded well. And I was on the 3rd floor. It's like an army barracks. Most of them were Mexican, a couple of Englishmen. When you're arrested by the Immigration Service, they offered me what they call a voluntary departure. And for $28, if I could get a bus ticket, I could get back to Toronto. And I had deleted my entire family when I left home. And I had no choice but to call my mother. And I had to call her collect. And the only reason she took the phone call, Dr. Sherri, to tell me what a bastard I was, just like the father that ran away, and that I deserved to be in jail the rest of my life, and she hung up. Wow. So I couldn't get $28 from my mother, so I decided I was going to escape. I didn't speak Spanish, but the guy next to me was in charge of collecting all the laundry to send down a chute. So for months, I was pantomiming like Sid Caesar, and he finally understood, and they were going to help me escape. So they put me in the basket, they sent me down the chute, and I landed on the floor. Now, I cased the place so well, I did it on a Wednesday. It was the busiest day of the week. I knew where the doors were. One led to the ocean, where I would swim out and get on a boat if I had to. The other led to a bus stop. So I get down there, I rush to the door that leads to the bus stop. It's locked. I rush to the door that leads to the ocean. It's locked, and I keep going back and forth. What is wrong? A half hour like a crazed rat in a trap. So I sit down on the dirty clothes and I fall asleep. About 20 minutes later, I'm awakened by a guard who said, "Oh, look at this. We got a live body in the dirty clothes." He said, "Young man, what are you trying to do?" And I said, "Escape." So he said, "Well, come with me." So we go upstairs, and for an hour they questioned me to find out whether or not I had accomplices. I convinced them I did not. So he took me back upstairs, and when he put me down in my cot, and everybody's watching now because they're afraid that maybe I ratted on them. And I said to him, I said, officer, you know, it's Wednesday. Why is everything locked down? He said, John, it's July 4th. It's an American holiday. So my nickname, Dr. Sherri, became Julio Quattro. But the punchline to this is exactly 30 years later, when I was 47 years of age, I get this letter from this guy that says to me, John Barbour, you have to tell me you're the guy that I found in the dirty laundry at the basement of the detention center. And I told my wife and my kids and my grandkids and neighbors that that's the John Barbour that I caught. And they tell me that I'm not. So please tell me the truth. So Dr. Sherri, I got a great picture of me with my arms around Sarah Purcell. I'm in a $600 suit. And I sent him the picture and I said, thank you so much for contacting me. I said, because for years I've been trying to find you to thank you, because if you hadn't caught me, I'd either be in the Merchant Navy or I'd be in prison. Instead, I'm co-hosting the show that changed the face of American television, the show that I created. And it all came about by accident, Sherri, because the year before I had quit the business entirely.
John, just wow, that's amazing. So I just want to intercede here for just a second, because we have an hour to do this, and we're at the bottom of the hour, and a whole bunch more people have just joined us. So I just want to make sure everybody knows this is John Barbour, who has changed the course of so many industries in Hollywood and on television and in mainstream media and in news. And so that's just an amazing, amazing backdrop of how you got from, getting deported and kicked out of Canada, and then you ended up to the place of you're on your way to Hollywood. So when you got to Hollywood, I just want to mention this because I think this is really important. I read the introduction to your book. So John, one of his books is, the name of the book is Your Mother's Not a Virgin, which is 720 pages of stories that I'm sure that every single chapter and every single story could be a movie in and of itself, or a full book in and of itself. And the foreword was written by Donald Jeffries. And he said, the stories, I mean, you guys can all tell from just the first few minutes that we've spoken here, what an amazing, amazing life that you've had, John. And I do have to put an intercede there. Nothing happens by accident, and there's no coincidences. And there's no accidents, right? So I'll paraphrase what Jeffrey said in your introduction to your book. He said, John Barbour is 85 years old, but has lived a life full enough to be twice that old. He's lived a life of determination and unfailing courage, having done so with a unique kind of civility and an ever-present sense of humor. So, John, from the beginning, I mean, I do want to talk a little bit about your sojourn into Hollywood and the Real People show, but you lived your whole life from the time you grew up 6 years of age on the streets with just an incredible determination. What drives you? What has been your primary driver your whole life?
Do you know what, Dr. Sherri, that's a really good question, and it's asked me all the time, and sometimes I even ask myself, do you know what it is? It's just loving being alive. And I wasn't alive until I was after 6 years of age and out on the streets. I mean, my mother was horrifying. I don't want to tell any of those stories. They're in the book. And they're heartbreaking stories. And I deleted my sister. I deleted my mother. I deleted my half brother. I deleted everybody. But when I got out on the streets, just the joy of being alive.
Wow.
And then again, it didn't hit me until, as I mentioned, I was at, the blackjack table at in Las Vegas, and I realized, hold it, I'm getting no satisfaction out of making money. And I must tell you, Dr. Sherri, when I got into television, I didn't get into television because I was looking for money or I was looking for fame, which is why most people get into it. I was looking for myself.
Wow.
So when I found really interesting guests, unbelievable people, I put people on the air that they didn't even want on the air. And Muhammad Ali, I put on the air for an hour in 1970 when everybody wanted him dead, because he said, I have no problem with the yellows in Asia, just whites in America. When they called Jane Fonda Hanoi Jane. And we used to have something called the fairness doctrine in media. So when I interviewed Ronald Reagan for an hour, a Republican, I then had to put a Democrat on. Then I had to put a socialist on. And one time I even had to put a Nazi on. In those days, we had real journalists.
Yes.
And my two inspirations to get into television, first, again, you're too young, but it was Jack Paar. Jack Paar was by far the greatest late night talk show in history.
Yep.
Not only did he do a great monologue at the top of his show, now Johnny Carson did a nice monologue, and Carson was great with show business people, but he was just a god-awful human being, incapable of handling any kind of intellectual conversation. But look at Jack Paar introduced Gore Vidal and William F. Buckley and John Kennedy. I mean, just all kinds of people. And he had conversations. And as a kid, I didn't know that people talked to one another. I thought they hit one another or they yelled at one another. So that's why I decided to become a stand-up. And then my other hero was Edward R. Murrow, who single-handedly brought down Joe McCarthy and the House Un-American Activities Committee. And once he did that, they got rid of him. They didn't want that. You know, in those days, we had fantastic journalists. And I could name you from Bishop Fulton Sheen, who became the #1 show in television. He beat out Milton Berle, a great comic. Here you have a Catholic priest who becomes the #1 star in America. I could name you 40 people who were intellectual inspirations for me in American television. Now I can't name one. Not one single person in American television do I admire. And the most articulate person on television right now happens to be on Turner Classic Movies. He does film noir. He explains these old movies, and he's the most articulate man left in television. You know, when real people came along, nobody understood it except me. I was the storyteller. I was dubbed the godfather of reality television by Gary Deeb, who was the best television critic in America. At one time, in the early 70s, he said, television is the only business in America where competition does not improve the product.
Oh, wow.
And he was so right.
Line. What a great line.
Yes, he's brilliant. So when he dubbed me that, it was because I had created real people. And I said to him, I made this prediction. I said, you know, Gary, what has happened is with this show, I've opened a bottle of great expensive Lafite Rothschild French wine. And it's just wonderful. This is reality television. But if you leave that bottle open, in 30 years, it's going to turn to vinegar. And that's what's happened to American television. When I got in, Dr. Sherri, you had to have a modicum of talent. You had to have a bit of a personality. You had to be kind of smart. And I guess I was a little of all that. These are things now that would get you fired in television. Now in television today, to be a reality star, all you need is an absence of shame.
Oh, wow. Very well said. Sadly true, but very well said. You know, I agree with you so much. And I think there were a lot of comments coming up here on Instagram of people saying how they miss real journalism, balanced journalism, truly investigative journalism. Did you know Nicholas Regish? Did you know that name?
No, I don't know the name at all, dear.
He wrote the second opinion columns for Peter Jennings. in that period, like in the 70s and 80s. Nick was a really, really good friend of mine. He passed away in about 2005, I believe. Well, he was from Montreal. He was Canadian, and we got to be really good friends. And he told me lots of stories about what it was really like in a real newsroom. And he said, everybody thinks there's all this deep discussion. He said, discussion is like, what do you think? What do you think? Okay, we'll do it. He said it's nothing like what you thought it was. And Nick was inspirational in helping me write my first book on bird flu. And he told me, he said, that's the problem with doctors trying to be writers. You guys get yourself in trouble all the time because you don't leave yourself an out. And so he trained me and taught me so much. And after he passed away really suddenly, his wife said, and we're friends for a while. And he said to me, every time he wanted to talk to you, Sherri, he said he would stop everything if you called or whatever. And he said, Nick never talked to anybody, but he really liked talking to you. And he taught me so much. And it was such a sneak behind some of the things that happened in the newsroom. Do you think that given the level of censorship and all of the media mogul giants that own everything today, do you think that journalism went away because they trained it out of them or because people were just sellouts?
No, journalism went away because it was destroyed by the worst president in American history.
And who would you declare that to be?
Okay, the worst president in American history. If your audience gets a chance, by the way, what was the name of your first book?
It was Bird Flu, It's Not What You Think. And I was writing it in real time. And my premise was that this was an environmental catastrophe. It really had nothing to do with the virus. And I was able to go through an enormous amount of documents and prove that you could take garden variety influenza viruses and expose it to dioxin, and it would weaponize it and create mass destruction. The highest concentrations of bird flu in terms of infection were in Southeast Asia, and I found maps of in Vietnam of where we heavily sprayed dioxin and Agent Orange.
Oh my God!
They overlapped exactly of where the highest
You want to know something, Dr. Sherri?
Yeah.
You didn't write the book because you wanted to write the book. You wrote the book because you had to write the book. And when you write a book that's entitled that, you're not going to have a very vast audience. But what you did was comparable to what Rachel Carlson did when she wrote Silent Spring. She made people aware of the pollution that was in the environment. But anyway, I want to get back to the business of why when I was in television in the early days, and it was filled with great journalists and great talk show hosts, you had literally hundreds of great journalists. And because of Bill Clinton, we no longer have journalists. We only have opinion makers.
Oh,
Everybody on television has an opinion. And I'll tell you how it came about. When John Kennedy was alive, Dr. Sherri, Thomas Jefferson and both John Kennedy said, more important than any human on the planet or in the country or any president is the First Amendment. You cannot have a functioning democracy without an informed electorate. We do not have that now. When John Kennedy was alive in 1963, there were 1,500 different owners of media.
Oh, wow.
And along comes Bill Clinton. Now, this is not an opinion, because I don't express opinions. I post facts and let you draw your own conclusions. First of all, he signed NAFTA. And NAFTA destroyed manufacturing and jobs in America. It sent jobs to Mexico and Asia and underpaid workers around the world. That's the first thing he did. So he destroyed manufacturing and jobs. And then he repealed something called Glass-Steagall. Have you ever heard of Glass-Steagall?
I have not.
Okay. During the Depression, Franklin Roosevelt signed a law called Glass-Steagall because the Depression was created because there were no regulations on Wall Street and the bankers.
Yes, I'm remembering.
So he signed Glass-Steagall, which prevented them from gambling with our money.
Yep.
And Billy Clinton comes along and he repeals Glass-Steagall. It led to the 2008 recession. Myself and millions of other Americans lost their homes. I lost mine. And the Justice Department pinpointed 200 bankers and stockbrokers who could be arrested for fraud and imprisoned. There was not one arrest. Now you would think, okay, he's destroyed homes, he's destroyed jobs, then he destroyed lives. You probably don't remember this either. He was the president that authorized the FBI and the military to firebomb a religious compound in Waco, Texas. They incinerated 87 innocent women and children. I mean, all they had to do was starve them out. You didn't have to burn them out. But to me and to America, he destroyed America because in the middle 60s, he signed the Communications Act. He took all of the media, 96% of it, and put it into the hands of 6 major corporations. These corporations are monopolies.
Absolutely.
And I remember you won't, gosh, I hate to keep saying you weren't old enough, but I remember when the Supreme Court ruled that AT&T was a monopoly.
I remember that. I'm older
And they
than
had
you
to
think,
destroy,
John.
yeah, now they had to destroy and disembowel AT&T, and everybody thought, oh, the phone company is going to be wrecked. But guess what? Now we have 10 great phone companies. And when I was in Hollywood, the Supreme Court ruled that the Hollywood studios could no longer own motion picture theaters. They had to get rid of them. And everybody was afraid that the movie industry would die. And it didn't. It flourished. Movie theaters flourished and the motion picture companies flourished. Now, nobody has in a democracy. It is not important that Donald Trump or Joe Biden or John Kennedy ever answer any questions. It is important that people ask them. And we have no journalists with the balls or the brains or the concern to ask important questions, because it's possible that Donald Trump would still be president if he had just taken his pen and signed an executive order reversing the Communications Act and putting it back into the hands of Americans. I mean, you shouldn't just be on Instagram, for God's sake. You should be on NBC or CBS or ABC or a network that you could own. You should be like Oprah. You should have your own television network. And there are a lot of people like that. That's why, and so I would suggest, if you want to have a really entertaining, informative laugh, if you go to my site, which is www.johnbarbersworld, and just Google the USA's 10.5 worst American presidents, you will have the greatest history lesson you'll ever had since Howard Zinn wrote his book, A History's People of the United States.
Wow. So let's stop for just a second on that, John, because we're winding down here on time, and I don't want to. And I really, oh my gosh, we could go on for hours and hours and hours. This is like the best conversation, and everybody's really loving this.
Well, you and I should be in a bar somewhere.
Absolutely.
Having a drink and just talking.
Absolutely. And I would have to record it because you say so many important things, I wouldn't remember all of it. I bet you that, because that's really true about the media and the fake news and all the different things that are kind of set up the way they are. Do you think, we've only got a few minutes left, so keep your answer a little bit short here. Do you think that today, given this environment, and somebody like John Barbour comes along and says, I want to upend and change things, do you think it'd be possible?
It's totally impossible. Listen, at the end of my movie, The American Media and the Second Assassination of President John F. Kennedy, in which Jim Garrison absolutely, totally proves that it was not Lee Harvey Oswald, it was the American government and the CIA that murdered John Kennedy. At the end of it, I put together a 10 most wanted list of people alive to this day, beginning with Dan Rather, who in 1963 lied to us about the headshot sending the head fully forward instead of backwards, as we saw a dozen years later in the Zapruder film. And I took this 10 most wanted list to the Justice Department because it's a cold case. And you know, it was President Carter who said America will never be the same unless we get to the bottom of the John Kennedy murder. And it is a cold case. The House Select Committee said that the murders of Martin Luther King and John Kennedy were conspiracies and should be further investigated. And nobody has ever asked any president. For example, if I had a chance to talk to Joe Biden, the first thing I would ask him would be to sign an executive order reversing the Communications Act so we can all be informed, and then to open the cold case of John Kennedy and Martin Luther King at the Justice Department. That's why America is in the total mess it's in. And you know what? This country will never allow the rise of a Martin Luther King or a Robert Kennedy or a John Kennedy or even a Ralph Nader again.
Wow.
They will either destroy him physically or they'll destroy him with slander.
Yeah. Well, there's certainly an agenda, John. And, you know, and everything now is driven towards that agenda, which appears to be the destruction of America, the elimination of our Constitution, the reversal of our Bill of Rights, taking away people's rights to bodily autonomy and choosing whether or not you want to be vaccinated. It seems as though they are hell-bent for destruction of this country. Would you agree with that, or do you have a different opinion on that?
Well, it's not that I have an opinion. Just like you, I see what is happening.
Yes.
But it does not affect the 1% who own the country. You know, it was George Carlin who said, you know, they belong to a club to which you and I do not belong.
Yes.
And, you know, America could be, you know, I so love this country. Oh, my God, look at, I was deported from it twice, once at 17, once at 29. And I was out of work. I quit the business when I was 46. And then a year later, I had the most successful show in the history of American television. And you know what? You said nothing ever happens by accident. And I said I was a non-believer, but I believe in the truth. And the truth is, there has been some kind of divine intervention in my life.
Absolutely.
That I report on in the book, and you will read it. Just astounding things. Joseph Campbell, who was America's greatest philosopher,
Absolutely.
He wrote The Power of Myth.
Yep.
He said, if you follow your joy, doors will open in the universe to help you get to that joy that you didn't even know existed. And that happened to me, Angel, because I followed the joy. My joy is I survived as a youngster listening to stories and reading stories. I lived in a library. I lived next to the radio. And you remember Ben Cartwright and Bonanza, Lorne Greene? He was a Canadian, and he used to tell stories on the radio, and I was glued to those stories. I'd go to a movie, and Guy de Maupassant, short story writer. I'm reading him when I'm 6 and 7. Somerset Maugham, Mark Twain. I just read and memorized. I'm a storyteller, and that's what I've done all my life. Even if I write a joke, I consider it a story. Or if I write an essay, I consider it a story. That's my joy. And I followed it. And you know what? I don't know anybody luckier than I am.
Wow. So, John, you where do you live now?
I live in Las Vegas now. Isn't that a paradox? Because that's where I wanted to go when I was 17. And I left Los Angeles when I semi-retired to move to Las Vegas because there's no state income tax. So I moved here for monetary. And guess what? I sold a home and I had like $600,000 left over. So the government made you spend money on a home. You had to spend the whole 600. So I was looking for a $600,000 home here in Las Vegas just for me and my wife and my son and our 3 rescued cats. And I could not find one expensive home with a bookcase in it.
Oh, wow.
No
Well, John,
bookcases in homes
the
in
last
Vegas.
couple of minutes we have here before we, John's going to graciously do an additional interview for us here for our members, for our premium members. That'll be in the premium content area of the podcast. But you're 85 years old. You are brilliant.
87. Let me tell you something, Dr. Sherri. I'll be, oh my God, 88 in a month. I consider myself intellectually 5,000 years old. Chronologically, I'm 87 years old, but emotionally, I'm only 8 years old.
Wow.
And it's the emotional 8-year-old that I love the most, because in Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tale, he looked at the emperor and he says, the emperor has no clothes. So the truth tellers are the young ones. And I remember when I was on the Tonight Show with Frank Sinatra, and he wanted me to do a bunch of jokes about Nixon. And it was a straight line, and I was introducing the joke about Nixon. And I said, as a comic today, you don't have to write jokes about politicians to get laughs. All you have to do is quote them, which got a huge laugh. And then I said, if Richard Nixon, as Hans Christian Andersen's kid said, is wearing no clothes, then it's logical he should be arrested for indecent exposure. And it got a massive ovation from the audience. So that's why I love the 8-year-old in me.
So your 8-year-old emotions, your brilliant 5,000-year-old mind from all of the stories in the books and everything, and your soon to be 88-year-old body. So what do you plan to accomplish in the next 20 years of your life?
Just to continue doing what it is that I do. I mean, when you take a look, I hate to say this, when about 7 years ago, I did a YouTube attacking Senator Harry Reid right here in Las Vegas, because he was a whole lot more supportive. He was very unbalanced in his overly strong support of Israelis as opposed to Palestinians. And it got 85,000 views. And in 2016, I had supported and sent money and jokes to Bernie Sanders. And I sent him advice on how he could get rid of Hillary Clinton. And all he would have to do was show that clip of Hillary Clinton cackling over how they murdered Gaddafi in Libya. She said, we came, we saw, we killed. Ha, ha, ha. And I said, you show that and you'll never see her again. But then I attacked him because he folded his tent and moved into hers instead of creating a third party needed in this country to run against Donald Trump. And even if it had been thrown into the House of Representatives, we would have had an absolute total choice between somebody on the left with him and somebody on the right or the middle right with Donald Trump. It got 55,000 views. I was very proud of that, but the best thing I think I've ever done is the 10 and a half worst presidents of the United States.
And tell people again what your website is so they can go and read that.
It's www.johnbarbersworld.com. And not only that, Angel, they can see the first Garrison tapes for nothing.
Wow.
They can see me with some, and Red Fox was my mentor when I started as a stand-up comic. He was my only lifelong friend. And when I got my first variety show, he was the first person I booked on the show, which led to Sanford and Son. Do you know that his name is John Sanford?
Wow.
That's his real name. And he called himself Fred on the show because he loved his older brother, Fred, who had died. I mean, all these stories are in the book. And again, the nice thing about the book, Angel, while it's a tale, as Don Jeffries called it, he said it's David Copperfield Goes to Hollywood. But you don't have to start at page 1 and go to the end of the book to read this amazing Canadian rags to riches to American riches story. It's all, there's not one chapter. There are only column headings. It's like a newspaper columnist who's assembled all his columns in a book. So, like I was the first host of the Gong Show when I was Gong. If you want to just read that 5 or 6 pages before you go to sleep, that's all you have to read.
Well, John, this has just been absolutely amazing. I am so grateful. When Michelle when I saw that you were, I said, how did he agree to do an interview with me? Oh my gosh, I was so honored to have you on this morning.
Oh, listen, you have no idea how many fans you have, including me. And Donald, when Donald Jeffries heard that I was going to be on your show, he called me. He said, "John, she's my favorite."
Aww.
And he's on all kinds of shows, but he absolutely adores you. You're loved around the world, Angel.
Oh, thank you.
So my question is, and I adore Michelle, who can sing like a bird, by the way, but how come she works in Toronto and you work in the U.S.?
We met, we do a twice annual online vaccine education boot camp course, and she took our course. And then at the end of the course, my business partner and I host an online debate. So we pick a group of people from our course, and some are pro-vaccine and one are anti-vaccine, and they debate, and then they switch sides. And Michelle, Michelle was one of the people, so that they can practice. They can practice.
Oh my gosh! And so, do you know how brilliant that is? When my son was at Walter Reed High School, he was 15 years of age. The courts in Los Angeles set aside 1 day, 1 week a year in a court. And they take the brightest students in the city. They give them a case to argue as a prosecutor, and then the next day they have to argue as the defense.
Yep.
And there's no better way to learn than taking both sides of that story. So that's brilliant what you're doing.
So Michelle was one of our main debaters. She was like on both sides. She was like on fire. And so I tracked her down. Actually, several of the employees that I have that work in our company all came through our boot camp course. So we got to know them. We got to know that they were on our side. So John, we're going to have to close this out today, and we're going to reconvene here in just a couple of minutes because on our Zoom call. But I want to thank everybody for being here today. It's going to be several thousand, there'll be thousands of more that are going to watch this. And as we close out today, make sure that you go to John Barbour's World. It's John Barbour's World. Several of those people have posted it up there. And take a look at those 10.5 important presidents and get the lesson. Get his book. I'm telling you, just reading through the book, it's a big tome. It's like 720 pages, but each individual chapter is a story.
You know what a lady doctor said to me? She's from Iran. She's in Phoenix, so it's her second language. She said it was going to take her 3 months to read the book. She read it in 10 days, and then she put a great review on Amazon. But she called me up and she said, "John, I must tell you, holding it gave me carpal tunnel syndrome."
So we're going to save this. It will be posted tomorrow up in it'll be on Instagram Live here for the rest of today, excuse me. Then it will be in Podbean, the Tenpenny Files, which is launched today, and we've got 2 free podcasts a week that we're going to do there, and then a monthly Ask Me Anything and a whole bunch of other things. So you can find those. And the other thing that you can do, everybody that's here, we have consolidated all of our many, many internet platforms. We have Mastering Vaccine Info, we have Baxter, we have a whole bunch of things. We're on every social media platform, and we've consolidated into one place so you can find everything that when you want to follow me, you can find it at drtenpenny.com. So drtenpenny.com, drtenpenny.com. If you just run your cursor across the navigation bar at the top, you can find everything that we're doing. And the new boot camp, all new content. We're going to be talking about that over the next couple of weeks because it starts March the 1st. So with that, John, I thank you so much. Oh my gosh, what an entertaining
Well, let me tell you, my wife, who is Mexican, says the greatest thing about some human beings, and not many people have it, is those people who have what is called simpatico. Angel, you have simpatico in spades.
Aw.
You are so huggable. Aside from being listenable, you are huggable. So thank you so much for having me. And I look forward to doing it again sometime.
All right. Thank you so much, John. This has been John Barbour, johnbarbersworld.com. Amazing stuff. Get his book and support what he's doing. And so we're going to close out today with my favorite Bible verse, which really means something to me. And it's Romans 12:12. Rejoice in hope, be patient in trouble, and be persistent in prayer. So until we meet again next Monday with another new guest, this will be posted up at it's Podbean later this week. Stay strong, stay healthy, and we'll see you again next week. Thank you, John. We'll see you in a few moments. Take care.
Okay, love.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.